So we're on chapter 26 of your world history book, and we're talking about the Cold War, a war against ideologies of communism and the free world. We got to the point of the Berlin blockade and Berlin airlift, what happened in Berlin. But first, we're talking about how Germany was divided into the East and the West, and the West Germany being the free enterprise part of Germany, and East Germany being under communist rule. And so what happens with Berlin? Well, Berlin is the capital of Germany, and it too was divided between the West Berlin and East Berlin. Well, communist control of Russia, when Soviet control, wanted to come in and take over all of Berlin. So, unable to reach an agreement with Soviets about Berlin, this situation in the Russian zone of occupation of Germany, they had a new currency for West Berlin in 1948. So basically, West Berlin developed its own currency and had the help of the Western nations, including the United States. Well, that angered the Soviets and the communist section of Berlin, thinking that they wanted full control of the city of Berlin. So the Soviets retaliated by a blockade of all railways, waterways, and road routes that were coming in to West Berlin. The Americans then had to come to the city's rescue because the blockade would really starve those people. They would not be able to get food or medicine or supplies or anything, as everything was blocked coming in. So the communist East Berlin would have full control of the whole city. So it says Americans came to the rescue. This is such a spectacular event that you can really be proud of being an American. The Americans came to the city's rescue by establishing what they called the Berlin Airlift. So all through that winter of 1948 to 1949, to save 2.25 million West Berliners from starving, the Americans dropped food and supplies constantly, so that all the people there would be able to make it through the winter unharmed. At one point, it says American transport planes were landing in West Berlin almost every 45 seconds, bringing medicine, food, fuel, and other necessities. So that's a lot of planes. The Russians then lifted the blockade in May of 1949. So at the spring, they decided to lift that blockade, but the Americans continued to bring supplies until September, and this really increased the prestige of America as the world was looking on how America came to help those Berliners, those West Berliners that were going to be starved out. So, pretty spectacular. So let's go on to this new organization that was formed during this time. It's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, with the threats of communism, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations signed a defense pact to defend each other in 1949. These countries were Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal. And they became a security for each other. In fact, they delineated a security area in the North Atlantic and in Western Europe to protect each other. NATO provided for mutual consultation and defense whenever the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any nation in that group would be threatened. So basically protecting each other in the midst of a communist country threatening them. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower was named the first supreme commander of NATO's military forces in Europe. So the United States actually would be the supreme leader of NATO, right? NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Russian countered and denounced NATO right away as an aggressive alliance. They said, what are you guys doing allying yourself together? You know, they got upset. So they made their own alliance. They called it the Warsaw Pact to be their own defense in 1955. So they would counter NATO by having a similar group of, especially their satellite nations, that would defend each other. So, here's some pictures of these NATO now. All of these countries now are still, we still have this NATO here. So all these countries said that they would defend each other, and see how they developed over the, now there's more countries to have joined the NATO group. The common market. So the Western nations, the Western European nations, they got together and they wanted to cooperate with each other and form closely due to the domination of Eastern communists, they wanted to form their own common market of enterprise economically. So in 1958, the Western Europe formed the common market, or they also called it the EEC, European Economic Community. So they're combining not only for defending each other, but now for economically helping each other financially, right? The original members were France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and later Great Britain, Ireland, Denmark, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. They all joined this group of the common market. So you're having all these Western countries joined together. They actually called themselves Europia, you know, as they combined together to economically support each other. The false hope of peaceful coexistence. So a false hope for peace happened after Joseph Stalin, remember he's the great mass murderer in Russia, killing like up to 40 and 50 million people. He died in 1953. So there was after he died, what would happen? There was a bitter power struggle in the Soviet Union. Who would rule Russia now? And in 1955, Nikita Khrushchev, this guy here, this picture of Nikita Khrushchev here, emerged as the new leader of Russia. Khrushchev surprised the world when he denounced Stalin's gruesome tactics. So Khrushchev said, I'm not going to behave as Stalin did. So he would de-Stalinize Russia. That's what his goal was. Although he had been one of Stalin's most important henchmen, so he always had been behind Stalin before. But he gave the false impression that Soviet communism was mellowing or softening its tactics, that it no longer aspired to rule the world anymore. And he called this de-Stalinization of Russia. But he did give a false hope because he still entered into communism, but gave that look that they would have a peaceful coexistence. Maybe the Cold War would end, but it did not. So here's a picture of him de-Stalining. He's getting rid of the head of Stalin there. A lot of Russians really hated him too. Of course, he killed a lot of Russian people. Stalin did. But now we have Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union in Russia. Unrest and suffering in Eastern Europe. So now in Eastern Europe, being controlled by communism there. So they were discontent after World War II in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Eastern European satellites suffered far greater than any other of the European colonies did, of course. They were being controlled. They have no freedom. They had the suppression of their personal, religious, and political freedoms, which added to the people's poverty and caused some of these countries to try to rebel against the communist regimes. Late in 1940, Marshal Tito was the dictator of Yugoslavia. He established his own brand of communism right here, Tito. And it too was very harsh, I'll just say that, outside of the Soviet sphere of control. The people of Poland, on the other hand, they revolted in 1953 and in 1956. And the Polish government did give voters a choice in elections. This was very rare. Most of the Eastern Europe that was controlled by communists had no freedom and no votes at all. But Yugoslavia and Poland were the only exceptions. The rest of the Eastern Bloc, those communist countries controlled by Russia, who dared to revolt, experienced the crushing heel of Soviet retaliation, especially East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. They were totally controlled, and all of their freedoms were taken away in that Eastern Communist Bloc controlled by Communist Soviet Union, Russia. Now the Berlin Wall. We talked about the Berlin airdrop that happened. Well, after the Berlin airdrop happened in Germany, we're talking about Germany. Remember, West Germany was the free part of Germany, and East Germany was controlled by the communists. So the Berlin Wall was put up. This was a wall. It was a symbol of Soviet oppression in Eastern Europe. They put up this wall. They put up the wall so that people could not get out. So in August of 1961, the communists built a wall between East and West Berlin. Remember, Berlin is the capital of Germany, to keep East Berliners from escaping into the West. They even divided families. Can you believe that? Over 2 million East Germans had fled to the West since 1949 to escape the horrible oppression of communism. So before the wall went up, people were fleeing as fast as they could to the West Germany. They did not want to live under communism and have their freedoms taken. So it was the first time in history that a wall was built to keep people inside their own country rather than keep enemies out. So they had to keep their people in because the people wanted out of communism. How sad. They had guards there with armed weapons, guns, barbed wires, searchlights at night to make sure no one was sneaking in to go over the wall. And these defenses lined the communist side of the wall. So on the communist side of the walls, you can see there people were trying to sneak over, and hundreds of people died. They were shot to death, and they were tortured. They were put in jail for trying to get over the wall to their freedom, in West Berlin. This is such a grim reminder of the enslavement under a communist system and how bad it can be. You can see some of these pictures here. See me back up here a little bit, kind of. See the pictures up here of the people crying at the Berlin Wall because they wanted their family. Maybe part of their family was the other side. They wanted to get out of communism. And see here, the people trying to get over, and this lady trying to get over, and ended up, many of them getting killed. They'd get shot to death if they would try to go over the wall. Western Europe in the Cold War. So now let's talk about this. We're going to talk about what's going on in Western Europe. Western Europe were the free countries. So what's going on in the free countries? So, and during the Cold War, of course, we know that communism was trying to seep in to every country, even the free countries. That subversion, they called it. And spying, too. And they would send spies into all free nations. So the nations of Western Europe took a stand against further Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan, we already discussed that, helped to rebuild and give economic assistance to these countries so they wouldn't have to look to the Soviet Union. So by 1960s, they exceeded pre-World War levels of economic productions. By 1960s, they had pulled themselves out. Due to the Marshall Plan and the help of the United States, they had pulled themselves out of the poverty from World War II. And started rebuilding their countries. By 1960s, they exceeded these levels of economic production. That means they had gone beyond that. but socialists and communists infiltrated many of their governments. Plus, there still was this spiritual coldness, the root of man's problems, which also plagued Europe, which resulted in very weak moral standards. So in a lot of these countries, they still weren't, going back to the Lord and the evangelism that had happened in the past, in the early 1900s and late 1800s. They were plagued by things like humanism and, existentialism and atheism and socialism and all these things, all these isms that we talked about. And so they had, even though they were economically doing well, their moral standards were very low. West Germany, an economic miracle. So first we're going to talk about West Germany. So West Germany, it adopted a new constitution and a representative government. We're talking about West, not East. Remember, East Germany is controlled by Russia. So you can see here, Germany is trying to rebuild himself. See this picture here? This is how in 1945, Germany was devastated. They had been bombed and, gone through the war, and it's totally devastated. But now we're going to see Germany basically becoming an economic miracle, thriving. So under this chancellor named Konrad Adenauer, and he was a Roman Catholic and a very conservative politician, and he provided leadership for West Germany to recover from its wartime defeat. Here's a picture of Konrad Adenauer right here. Adenauer moved the nation towards a vigorous free market economy. He transformed West Germany into one of the most prosperous nations in the world. West Germany had gone through 2 world wars and been devastated, but now becoming a very thriving nation. West Germany had been pulled out of the pits. Let's just say that. By 1955, West Germany was producing more goods and services than the entire nation had in 1936 under Hitler. So they were producing more than Hitler could ever imagine. And of course, Hitler's long gone and dead, right? The power of free enterprise in stark contrast to the impoverished communist East Germany, which means West Germany was like a miracle. And if you compared it to East Germany under communism, East Germany was very much in poverty and very dark. And the people were not allowed, to have freedom in any way. So West Germany allied closely with the United States, forming a powerful deterrent to Soviet aggression. So West Germany became under the United States' help, right? And you can see this here, the production of cars in West Germany, and onto the farming in West Germany, and onto industry. West Germany was flourishing. Great Britain falls under socialism. After World War II, Great Britain fell under the influence of the Socialist Labour Party, which introduced state-controlled schools, compulsory health insurance, socialized medicine, nationalized industries, wage and price controls, and many other social programs. So under Great Britain started going into socialism, and socialism is government control. As a result, Britain's economy declined rapidly, and her ability to stand against communism was weakened. So the conservative power did return in 1951 under the prime ministers, again, of Winston Churchill and Harold Macmillan, but this improved the industry, but the welfare system was created by the Labour Party remained intact. Morality declined in post-war Britain, and churches were empty. So basically, Britain was falling under socialism, coming to communism. They weren't really seeking the Lord in those things, as we see the churches are completely empty. And this was a nation that once sent Christian missionaries all over the world. And now England was a mission field. Missionaries needed to come to England to tell them about Jesus. The Labour Party returned to power, making Britain decline even more. Just know, this Labour Party was very socialistic. And so Britain became losing a lot of things, and especially losing their Commonwealth of Nations, the dissolution of the mighty British Empire. So remember, at one time, England was a great nation controlling many countries as a commonwealth around as their Commonwealth nations, their satellite nations around the world. And so it basically said the sun will never set on the British Empire under Queen Victoria, as you recall. So the British Commonwealth of Nations was established prior to World War II, and several of Britain's colonies and possessions looked because they wanted to become independent. In fact, India, we picture India right here, India, one of their nations, achieved independence in 1947. Ireland, this right next to England, severed its ties completely in 1949, except for Northern Ireland, which were 6 countries that are still under England, under Great Britain. In 1950 and the 1960s, most of the British possessions in Africa and Asia became independent Commonwealth countries. They weren't ruled by England, they were just a Commonwealth of England. But many of these stagnated politically and economically and culturally as they adopted forms of socialism and became vulnerable to communism. So as the British countries were becoming independent, they still had poverty, they were still poor, they still had, and they went into socialism, and that socialism, of course, communism would come in, and dictators would come in during this time and bring in communism and control a lot of these countries. Now let's talk about France. What happened in France? France, of course, is the largest country in Western Europe, and it emerged with very damaged from World War II, as we know, as basically Hitler occupied and destroyed Paris and much of France. So they really needed to rebuild. And communists even controlled one of the largest political parties. Basically, as we see, France is really close to Germany in those areas, so it was pretty much of a shadow nation. France lost many of the Asian and African colonies, including Vietnam and Algeria. So the conflict over Algeria was so intense that France's Fourth Republic formed in 1946 and collapsed in 1958. So what happened there? Well, France, of course, like England, it had some colonies around the country, and one of its colonies was Vietnam. And they lost Vietnam, and Vietnam, well, of course, we'll find out, ran into communism, and so did Algeria. And that fight in Algeria was very intense. As you see here, there was lots of fighting between the French and from the Algerians, and they lost their country that was a commonwealth that they definitely had control over in that portion, and now would become communist too. So, France. France's Fifth Republic. Okay, number 5. So, France's Fifth Republic was under Charles de Gaulle. He was a leader in World War II, right? He was the leader of the Free French during World War II and returned to power and wrote a new constitution, now establishing the Fifth Republic. De Gaulle was elected as the first president of France. He promoted a strong economy and industry and strengthened the military. He also cooperated with the German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, remember, that helped Germany get off the ground in their economy, and to expand the common market. So he helped in all those areas. But after de Gaulle's death in 1970, France moved back towards socialism. In 1981, François Mitterrand of the Socialist Party became the president of France, and he was a socialist. But after Mitterrand nationalized France's industry, business, and finances, the economy started to fall because of his socialist ideas. But he had no choice then to implement the free enterprise program. So when you're talking about socialism, you're talking about government control. So he came in for government control. Charles de Gaulle was just totally into free enterprise and not into government control. And Mitterrand came in. So you have this because they were going through rebuilding and, coming out of the poverty of World War II. A lot of people would turn to socialized government programs, right? And that's what was happening in Great Britain and France. In fact, all of the countries of Europe actually would experience this. Italy. So what was happening in Italy? After World War II, Italy became a slow recovery under Alcide de Gasperi. And he died in 1954. And then Italy had all these 30 coalitions governments coming in. So Italy's having a hard time. In fact, communists and socialists began to gain power there, and the communists organized what's called the Red Brigades. These were terrorists which kidnapped and murdered Premier Aldo Moro in 1978, and quite a few other people, these Red Brigades that came into Italy. Remember how I said how the communism was trying to submerge into all these countries, and it was. The public was outraged over this communist violence, and they pushed for law and order. In 1980, a new government was finally formed. Here you have some pictures of these, the Red Brigade communist leaders here in Italy. After their conservative, Alcide de Gasperi, he was trying to help them form a free government. He had communists seep in. Spain and Franco. We're talking about Spain now. Francisco Franco and his nationalists. He was anti-communist, totally. Franco. He won in the Spanish Civil War in 1939, even before the war, and he managed to keep his shattered nation, which was shattered by civil war, out of the World War II. So Spain was a neutral country. But in 1945, the Soviet Union communists launched propaganda against Franco. Remember, he was anti-communist, for the overthrow of his anti-communist government. In 1953, Spain and the United States agreed to a 10-year pact that allowed Americans to build military bases in Spain. So America was coming into Spain and, in fact, building military bases there. But communists were trying to get into Spain too. But Spain received $1 billion in grants and loans from America to rebuild from their civil war. And Spain achieved one of the world's highest rates of economic growth between the 1950s and 1960s. When remember Franco was totally anti-communist, when he died in 1975, Prince Juan Carlos encouraged moderation and a democratic rule during the periods of unrest. So we have Spain coming forth and being a free nation. Scandinavia, of course, they were affected too. World War II had shattered many of their nations, especially when you think of Denmark and Norway and Sweden that were controlled by the Nazis, right? But after World War II, a lot of these countries decided to develop socialistic governments because they needed so much help, and they thought, we need government help, so we need to depend on the government, which was not good. They called some of these countries a socialist utopia. They were looking for that. The economies grew, but the decline in morality and religious faith, plus growing cost of welfare, took its toll in these countries. So, of course, a lot of them were humanistic and atheists, were once on fire for the Lord. So, high taxed and dependence on the state for daily needs under socialism caused a decline in the work ethic and eroded their moral restraints. Low worker productivity and rebellious young people and a growing national debt caused many Scandinavians to doubt the effectiveness of socialism too. So here, it looks to me, this is the last bit, and it looks to me, and I hope it looks to you, how socialism leading to communism has a negative effect on every country that comes in contact with it. So we have why? If you look at communism, it's very atheistic, against God. And if you look at socialism, socialism is too. Socialism looks towards the ideology of socialism rather than to the individual, and basically puts a lot of people, under government control. And when the government is an atheistic government, you're going to have problems, aren't you? So when you look into this, I hope that you're learning how the Cold War of communism has affected all countries of the world. But as we go through this time, until the 1990s, we were under this Cold War against the ideology of communism.